In 71 CE, the cobblestones of Rome trembled under the weight of the greatest and most cruel triumph in imperial history. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the roar of a frenzied crowd as the spoils of a shattered nation were paraded like common trophies. Prisoners shuffled through the streets in heavy iron chains, their eyes hollow with the trauma of a war that had erased their world. The spectators did not just see defeated soldiers. They witnessed the calculated humiliation of an entire civilization, watching as the sacred golden vessels of the Jewish temple were hoisted high for pagan eyes to devour. This spectacle was more than a military victory parade. It was a public declaration that Judean independence had been systematically dismantled, marking the beginning of a punishment so severe it would scatter a people to the four corners of the earth for nearly 2,000 years. To understand this moment of supreme Roman arrogance, we must rewind to the blood-soaked soil of the previous year. In April of 70 CE, the hills surrounding Jerusalem began to shimmer with the glint of Roman armor. General Titus, the ambitious son of Emperor Vespasian, arrived with a force of terrifying magnitude, commanding at least 48,000 troops to encircle the city walls. His timing was a masterstroke of psychological cruelty, for the siege began just 3 days before Passover. Thousands of pilgrims had traveled from across the known world, flooding the narrow streets of the city to celebrate their holiest festival. Unaware they were walking into a cage. The gates slammed shut, and what should have been a week of prayer and feasting instantly transformed into a suffocating death trap. Inside the fortified walls, the situation was already catastrophic before the first Roman arrow flew. Rival Jewish factions, blinded by infighting, were tearing the city apart from within. Leaders like John of Gischala, Simon Bar-Yochai, and Eleazar ben Simon had been locked in a vicious power struggle, their followers setting fire to the city's granaries and destroying precious food supplies in a short-sighted bid for control. It was only when the looming shadows of Roman siege towers darkened the skyline that these factions finally ceased their civil war to face the common enemy. They united their blades, but the alliance came too late to save the starving population. The resistance offered by the Jewish defenders was ferocious, driven by a desperate religious zeal, but the Roman machine was unstoppable. The siege unfolded with a slow, grinding brutality that turned days into nightmares. Roman engineers, masters of construction and destruction, built massive earthworks that crept inch by inch toward the city's limestone fortifications. The sound of battering rams thundering against stone became the heartbeat of the city, and every defensive wall that crumbled brought the legions closer to the sacred Temple Mount. Inside the tightening noose, starvation began to claim more lives than Roman swords. The food supplies, foolishly destroyed during the internal conflicts, vanished completely, leaving the population to wither. The streets became graveyards for the living, and those who tried to escape the famine found themselves caught in a horrific limbo. Jewish defenders on the walls executed anyone suspected of desertion, while Roman patrols waiting in the valleys slaughtered those who managed to slip out. The historian Josephus, who watched the tragedy unfold, recorded scenes of depravity that defy imagination, describing residents reduced to gnawing on leather belts and shoes to quiet the agony in their stomachs. In the depths of this madness, humanity completely unraveled. One woman, driven insane by the gnawing hunger, was reported to have committed an unspeakable act against her own infant, a testament to the absolute hell that Jerusalem had become. By late July, the constant pounding of the rams finally breached the formidable Antonia fortress, opening a path to the city's spiritual heart. Then, on August 30th, 70 CE, the unthinkable happened. In the chaos of the final assault, the Second Temple, the very axis of the Jewish world, caught fire. Desperate defenders rushed into the inferno, diving through flames to save their sanctuary with no regard for their own survival. But the momentum of destruction could not be halted. Roman soldiers, fueled by months of frustration and bloodlust, either ignored or openly disobeyed orders to preserve the magnificent structure. The cedar roof caught light, and the gold melted between the stones as the center of Jewish worship and identity was consumed by a pillar of smoke visible for miles. With the spiritual heart of the city beating its last, Roman forces proceeded to systematically raze Jerusalem to the ground. It was not enough to conquer. They had to erase. Buildings were torched, ancient walls were pulled down by teams of oxen and engineers, and entire neighborhoods were leveled into dust. By September, the great metropolis lay in absolute ruins, a landscape of smoldering ash and rubble. The Romans left only 3 towers from Herod's palace and a fragment of the western wall standing, not as a mercy, but as a grim monument to the strength of the fortifications they had crushed. Josephus claimed that over 1 million people perished in the carnage, and while modern historians often view ancient numbers with skepticism, even the most conservative estimates place the death toll in the hundreds of thousands. When the dust finally settled, the survivors faced a horror perhaps greater than death. The Romans implemented a brutal sorting process, filtering the human wreckage of Jerusalem with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. After executing the armed defenders and the elderly who were of no economic value, the legions processed the remaining population. Approximately 97,000 Jews were shackled and enslaved. This mass enslavement did not distinguish between soldier and civilian. It swept up families whose only crime was existing in a city that had defied the eagle of Rome. A person's age became their destiny. Those under 17 were immediately torn from their parents, herded together, and sold into servitude in markets across the empire, destined never to see their homes or families again. For the strongest survivors, a darker fate awaited. Thousands of robust men were selected for the arena, forced to become gladiators or bait for wild beasts. This was not a quick execution, but a form of prolonged torture designed to entertain the Roman mob, while reminding them of the price of rebellion. Many died in elaborate mass executions staged as mythological reenactments, dressed in costumes to play the role of doomed heroes before being butchered. Others were condemned to hard labor, assigned to construction projects that would memorialize their own defeat. In a cruel twist of irony, Jewish captives provided the backbreaking forced labor for the Forum of Peace and, most significantly, for the Colosseum itself. The very stone amphitheater where many of their fellow prisoners would later die for public amusement was built by the hands of enslaved Judeans. They constructed the monuments to their own subjugation. The rebel leaders who had commanded the defense of Jerusalem met grim ends. Simon Bar eventually surrendered and was transported to Rome, where he was the centerpiece of the triumph of 71 CE. He was paraded through the cheering streets before being dragged to the Mamertine prison and executed by hanging. John of Gischala was sentenced to life imprisonment, doomed to spend his remaining years in a dungeon as a living symbol of failed resistance, denied both his freedom and the dignity of a warrior's death. The rest of the enslaved population was scattered like seeds in the wind, shipped from the port of Gaza to provinces ranging from Egypt to Spain. Archaeological evidence has confirmed this vast dispersion. A tombstone discovered near Naples commemorates a woman named Claudia Astor, identifying her as a captive from Jerusalem. The poet Martial casually referenced owning a Jewish slave in his writings. These historical fragments reveal how thoroughly Rome integrated the conquered population into its economic machine. During the siege itself, the Roman forces had demonstrated a level of cruelty that served both practical and psychological purposes. As starvation tightened its grip on the city, desperate inhabitants would sneak out at night, hoping to forage for roots or scraps beyond the Roman lines. Those caught were not just killed. They were subjected to immediate and horrific punishment designed to terrorize those watching from the walls. Crucifixion became Rome's primary weapon of psychological warfare. Josephus recorded that Roman soldiers crucified Jewish captives within clear sight of the city's defenders. The scale of this operation was staggering. At the height of the siege, over 500 people were crucified every single day. The executions continued for months, turning the valleys around Jerusalem into a landscape of agony. The soldiers, consumed by rage at the stubborn resistance they had encountered, began to treat these deaths as a grim form of entertainment. Legionaries would nail victims in various twisted positions to break the monotony of the slaughter. Some were hung upside down, while others had their arms stretched at grotesque angles. Josephus described how the soldiers amused themselves by experimenting with different configurations of torment, turning the act of killing into a dark sport. The variety served no purpose other than to satisfy the sadism of the troops and to shatter the minds of the Jewish observers. Victims were first scourged, their bodies flayed by whips embedded with metal or bone fragments, before being forced to drag their own crossbeams to the place of execution. They were then tied or nailed through the wrists and feet. Archaeological evidence has provided a chilling testament to this practice. A heel bone discovered in 1968 near Jerusalem contained a 7.5-inch iron nail driven through it. The tip of the nail had been bent to prevent removal, locking the victim to the wood. Death by crucifixion was slow, a suffocation caused by exhaustion. The position made breathing nearly impossible, forcing victims to push up on their nailed feet to inhale, creating a cycle of searing pain that could last for hours or days. Eventually, as Josephus recorded, the Romans simply ran out of wood for crosses and space to erect them. The hillsides became a forest of dying bodies, a warning visible for miles in every direction. Titus understood that each crucifixion was a message. The Romans hoped the sight would break the will to resist, but even after the city fell, rebels captured in the countryside were crucified along the roads of Judea, their rotting bodies left on display as signposts of Roman authority. The destruction of the city was not the end of the punishment. Emperor Hadrian was determined to ensure that Jerusalem would never again serve as a rallying point for Jewish nationalism. His solution was to erase the city's identity entirely. On the ruins of the Holy City, he ordered the construction of Aelia Capitolina, a Roman colony whose very name proclaimed its new allegiance to the emperor and the gods of Rome. The city was redesigned with broad colonnaded streets, arched gateways, and pagan forums. On the very spot where the Jewish temple had stood, Hadrian erected a temple to Jupiter Capitolinus. To seal this cultural erasure, a formal edict was issued banishing all Jews from entering the city. This was not a temporary military restriction, but a permanent legal prohibition. Jews were forbidden from living in or even visiting their holiest site on pain of death. The ban was absolute, enforced by Roman authorities who viewed any Jewish presence as a security threat. The Romans permitted only one singular exception, designed to reinforce the totality of the defeat. Once a year, on the 9th of AV, the anniversary of the day the Second Temple was destroyed, Jews were allowed to enter the city to mourn. This annual pilgrimage became a ritual of profound grief, with Jews lamenting their losses while surrounded by the alien architecture of the pagan city that had replaced Jerusalem. Jerome described these gatherings in the 4th century, noting the sight of elderly Jewish pilgrims, covered in rags and weeping over the ruins of their former glory. Hadrian went further, renaming the province itself. He changed the name from Judea to Syria Palestina, deliberately choosing a name associated with the ancient Philistines, the biblical enemies of the Jews. This was not merely administrative reorganization, it was symbolic annihilation. The Romans sought to sever the linguistic and geographic connection between the land and its Jewish inhabitants. This renaming would have lasting consequences, as the modern name Palestine derives directly from Syria Palestina. The ban on Jewish residents in Jerusalem remained in effect for centuries, persisting even as the Roman Empire transitioned to Christianity under Constantine. It was only with the Muslim conquest in 636 CE that this ban finally ended. Though nearly 500 years had passed since Jews were allowed to live in their former capital, this systematic exclusion created a permanent diaspora mentality. For the first time in their history, Jews constituted a people without a political homeland, scattered across the Roman Empire and far beyond. Communities developed in Spain, North Africa, Italy, Babylonia, and Arabia, each maintaining their religious traditions while adapting to local cultures. The destruction of the temple and the permanent expulsion from Jerusalem necessitated the development of Rabbinic Judaism, which centered religious life on study, prayer, and community synagogues rather than temple sacrifice and pilgrimage. The consequences of Rome's actions in 70 and 135 CE extended far beyond the immediate violence and displacement. They fundamentally altered the trajectory of Jewish existence. Transforming a people primarily concentrated in their ancestral homeland into a dispersed minority navigating a hostile world. This diaspora existence, initially imposed by Roman force, would define Jewish life for the next 18 centuries, ending only with the establishment of modern Israel in 1948. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and join us for more history. Which aspect of this historical catastrophe strikes you as most devastating? Was it the physical destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the mass enslavement and executions, or the permanent exile that followed? The Roman campaign succeeded in its immediate military objectives, but ultimately failed to destroy Jewish identity itself, which persisted across centuries of dispersion.